this week is Dr. Ros Stuart-Buttle, and Ros is the former director of the Centre for Christian Education and Pastoral Theology at Liverpool Hope University. She has taught across school, diocese, seminary, and higher education sectors. She gained an MA in Catholic Religious Studies in New York and completed a PhD with the University of Liverpool in 2010. Her professional interests explore the relationship between theology and education, and she's written books, chapters, and peer-reviewed journal publications on adult theological formation, teacher professional development for church schools, religious education, and her special interest in online teaching and learning. Ros is a long-standing member of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales and their Board of Religious Studies, and she was principal investigator and author for their national research report, CCRS, 25 years on. She holds external examinerships with UK and Irish universities, and she's currently working as a freelance consultant in adult formation with a number of dioceses across England and Wales. Ros, we are absolutely delighted to have you with us today.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous and kind introduction. I'm feeling a little bit naked in one sense, in that I've deliberately chosen not to use PowerPoint slides. I guess we've all had a lot of these online meetings and online lectures where the speaker automatically shares their screen and shows their slides. Well, the good news for you is that I'm not going to do that. The bad news is you've got to look at me and maybe listen a little bit more carefully. I will from time to time pick up a few books and hold them in front of the camera, particularly when I'm making reference to that particular text. So the title of this guest lecture is perhaps a rather controversial title for some people. Why bother with theology? In fact, it's the title of a book that I read a number of years ago. And as Tricia's introduction has sort of mentioned, at the time I was working as senior lecturer in theology and education and as director of the Centre of Christian Education at Liverpool Hope University. And so much of my work was working with theology and religious studies, undergraduates and postgraduate students. But also I had the good fortune of being able to work with wider groups of adults undertaking some form of theological education as part of informal or lifelong learning or professional learning opportunities. So it could have been for preparation for ministry, for people with some professional or pastoral responsibility for leading others into faith, so maybe catechists or chaplains, youth workers, teachers, but also people who were interested and concerned with an engagement with theology for reasons to do with their personal faith, furthering their own discipleship, or for spiritual development, sometimes just out of sheer interest. So when I read the book, Why Bother with Theology? At the same time, going back, I was also teaching final year theology students an advanced seminar on John Henry Newman, where of course his ideas about theology as the discipline and science of discerning the nature of God and the nature of truth, and thus his posing theology as the queen of the sciences, those ideas came to the fore. And for Newman, theology was not to be restricted to a narrow discipline or an object of phenomenological study, but had its place in shaping and forming people in their learning and their engaging in the world of life and of work. So there were two very different ideas sitting on my office desk at the same time. Newman's ideas about theology, right next to Alex Wright's work on why bother with theology. Quite some contrast, but it certainly gave me much to think about. So Trisha's lovely introduction again hinted at my working over the years with many people, adults, encountering some form of Christian theology as part of their education or formation in faith. And doing this over the last 20 years has certainly confirmed to me in more ways than I could share now, both the need for and the demand from many people themselves for adult theological education opportunities, whether through formal study, through degrees or formal courses, or whether through lifelong learning in local professional or pastoral contexts. And it's certainly no surprise that the latest summary that certainly I've read of the responses from dioceses, Catholic dioceses across England and Wales in their summaries to the synod are identifying and calling for greater adult formation in faith and pointing to this as an urgent concern. Over 20 years ago, the Catholic bishops of England and Wales were saying the same thing. So this question of why bother with theology, I'd like to suggest it's not just a question that I've thought about for some time, but it's also has been and still is a very relevant question for today. So turning first to the book, Why Bother with Theology, and just outlining, giving the sort of a hint of the sort of things that this says. Well, it was written by Alex Wright, who was at the time was the director of the SCM Press. Of course, the book is dated. You know, like all books, it very quickly, the context moves on. The book's almost 20 years old, I think. It doesn't claim to be a formal analysis or an academic study, but it sets out to offer the author's response to how he believes theology is viewed in public perception. So I suppose I'd say that the book is more a sociological commentary rather than a theological study. Many of the themes that it raises have since been explored in more critical depth by later writers, and what would spring to mind would be Brown's The Death of Christian Britain, or Grace Davies' Religion in Modern Europe. And some of the issues that Alex Wright in Why Bother with Theology outlined have only become perhaps more urgent and more pressing as time has moved on. So he doesn't offer a historical analysis of the role of theology. He's more concerned with the state of theology today. He recognises that today there are a multiplicity of forms of knowledge, of the contexts that people live their lives in, of the values of our society and culture. And indeed, as we've become really aware over the last couple of years, the sheer connectedness that technology, or the lack of connectedness that technology brings us. And so he would claim that the very complex cultural dynamics of our postmodern era, and we might point to the biggies, the materialism, the individualism, secularization, religious pluralism, he would say Christian theology is simply just not the place where most people find themselves today. Instead, diverse intellectual and cultural beliefs and identities and values all exist side by side. And perhaps many of us would agree that our age is that of a social and cultural and maybe an intellectual fragmentation, with a suspicion of universal truths and belief systems. And indeed, for many people, the very notion that there might be a corpus or a narrative of truth, such as Christian theology might point to, it just is incomprehensible when it might seem that relativism or reductionism rule the day. And we know in just talking to people hold many different belief systems and perspectives, and they say that they're all equally valid, they're all deserving of consideration. And so the certainty or the dominance of once held certainties has largely gone. And even if there are those among us who sort of hold on to some of those certainties, well, then we all know the difficulties of trying to convey them from one generation to the next. So Alex Wright would claim that for many people, theology is obscure, perhaps outdated even in public perception. It often gets a bad press, seen as a bunch of questions that no one really cares about anymore. In the Middle Ages, so the legend says, it revolved around how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. And for some people, perhaps, you know, the way they think about theology hasn't really moved on much more than that. They might see it as focusing on doctrinal subtleties that perhaps they'd rather do away with or don't hold relevance. And I think, to be honest, I've experienced something of this myself in certain social situations. You know, the sort of conversations that go, well, do you work? Well, where do you work? Well, at university. Who do you teach? Well, I teach adults. You know, what do you teach? And then that hesitation, you know, do you say theology? And then when you do, the rather mixed responses that might come, sometimes certainly signalling interest and enthusiasm, sometimes bringing surprise or some form of judgment or even suspicion, sometimes simply a quick end to the conversation. So the reality is that in a pluralist, multi-ethnic, multi-faith context, theology can be perceived by those on the outside or those unknowing as irrelevant to the business of living today. That would be Alex Wright's claim. And he says this is particularly the case when theology is related to the marginalisation of Christianity and the church. And by and large, without wanting to be judgmental, but I only need to think of the wider extended family, my own family. People don't go to church. They don't necessarily think about church. Many quite happily operate their daily lives without explicit reference to God. Instead, they search for and they find their own ways and their own paths and their own truths in alternative directions in today's world. So if we accept Wright's line of thinking, we might conclude that there is a contemporary distrust and suspicion of theology in the public sphere, seeing it as inaccessible, authoritarian, highbrow, academic, removed from everyday experience. There was a very recent example of this, that the Times newspaper, I have actually kept the copy of the paper here, but it reported on the 28th of April, so only a couple of weeks ago. And it was reporting the UK Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, and he had been speaking out against the prison service using woke language. And the Times headline, or the leading article, and I'm now quoting, asked whether he agreed with the use of such language during his visit. Dominic Raab said he was interested in the practical steps that could reduce reoffending rather than theological debates. Well, I don't know about you, but I think that's a very strange way of expression for a government minister to talk about reforming the prison service. He was not using the word with any reference to God or transcendence or the divine. He was simply using the word, theologizing as a sort of a shorthand for something that was overtly theoretical or abstract, in contrast to the practical consequences or concrete outcomes that he was seeking for. So Wright makes a final point that even those who identify as churchgoers in some way or another, well, theology can be abstract, perhaps even authoritarian, a bit pompous or dull for them as well. And he says, just think, when theologians talk about the nature of sin and grace, the character of Christ's atonement, redemption, he says, what do today's pick and mix generation make of this? And he quotes the writer P.D. James, who in her autobiography wrote, and again I quote, "Theology has its own obscurantism." And she went on to say that if theology was to impinge on the lives of ordinary people, she said non-theologians, it needed to be communicated in language and ways that laymen and women could understand. And so Wright himself took the view that a meaningful connection between theology and men and women has been lost. And he says largely because the church has failed to respond in intelligible and sensitive language to the suspicions and the fears and the doubts and the cynicisms of a generation that's now learnt to question the established givens and claims about truth and authority. So Wright, in his question and his book, Why Bother with Theology, he gives us plenty to think about, even though we might say it makes for rather pessimistic reading. Well, of course, there's a very different sense of the role and status of theology when we approach from inside the church's tradition and understanding. And perhaps one question that Wright failed to address in his book is, what do we mean by theology? Perhaps it's the obvious question he should have asked. Again, there are many, many ways of answering that question. No doubt most of us here will have encountered the fides quorum intellectum, the faith-seeking understanding idea as expressed by Anselm and Augustine in the earlier centuries. I mentioned Newman earlier, who did see theology as a discipline and a science rooted in the supreme truth, God. And maybe we're more familiar, some of us, with more contemporary ideas of theology about finding a language or words to give expression to our lived faith. So there are different ways, we know, of thinking about theology. So perhaps we need to just unpack that a little bit if we are going to try and address this question of why bother with theology. Well, which theology, and what do we mean by that? Some of the different ways of thinking about theology were captured in a 2012 report by the International Theological Committee, which was captured in one of these Origins papers, 2012, called Theology Today: Perspectives, Principles and Criteria. As I said, 2012 report. It said sort of three things that have stayed with me and I've always found very helpful. Firstly, it said theology is a work of reason, an organised body of knowledge that proceeds from the truths of a higher science God himself. And this is illuminated by faith. Theology aims to understand in a rational and systematic manner the saving truth that is God. So perhaps this is the sort of faith-seeking understanding part that we're familiar with. But that ITC report also made quite clear that theology uses a variety of methods and contains a plurality of specialised disciplines. And it said theology isn't just the content of faith, it's not a noun. Theology is a verb, it's something we do. It takes a multitude of forms, and I'm now quoting from that report, that explore in myriad ways God's one saving truth as it is received in diverse ways by human beings. And so there are different disciplines: biblical studies, liturgy, patristics, church history, fundamental theology, moral theology, pastoral theology, catechetics, canon law, and so on. In the practice of doing theology, especially since the Second Vatican Council, of course, there are theologies from new cultural contexts: Latin America, Africa, Asia, theologies from lay men and women, giving new themes for reflection on peace, justice, liberation, gender, ecology, bioethics. And there are new venues for theological reflection through ecumenical, interreligious and intercultural dialogue. And this is without forgetting the partner disciplines: philosophy, history, the social and natural sciences. So we shouldn't constrain theology into one box and put a lid on it. We shouldn't limit its possibilities or directions. The third thing about theology that International Theological Commission report says, it says that theology is closely bound to spiritual experience, which it enlightens and is also nourished by. Thus, it said, theology opens into a search for authentic wisdom with a sense of the transcendence through the God of Jesus Christ. So theology is not just a science or a discipline. It's not just a doctrine or a method, but theology is also an invitation to wisdom, to rethinking and reorienting one's life. It's not just to be studied, it's to be lived. I think this raises some particularly interesting questions for how we approach or teach theology, not just in formal academic contents of our schools and universities, but say in professional or workplace learning, when theology must dialogue with the other languages of a professional and secular world. So why bother with theology? Well, I've realised that I'm likely to be speaking to the converted here today. But just for a second, while I pause breath, just pause for yourself and ask yourself, what does theology mean to you? Where do you encounter it? What sort of theology speaks to your experience? What sort of theology is most relevant for today? Perhaps when we have a short discussion or questions and answers afterwards, we might pick up on some of that. In my work in theology and education, I've always been really interested in how theology can speak to and impact adult learning. Many of us might be familiar with the 4 voices of theology model. If not, let me know and I will give a reference for you. But it's the 4 voices of theology that say, you know, we encounter the normative theology of the church, from the sources that are considered authoritative: scripture, magisterium, creeds, doctrine, liturgy. But we also encounter the formal theology, the theology of the academy, the intellectual articulation of faith, the critical and informed insight and inquiry from Christian tradition and other disciplines. But there is also the theology that is drawn from any group's own articulation of its beliefs. Espoused theology could be a local school, or a college, or a parish, and the way they express their faith and beliefs, for example, through a mission statement or a policy document. There is also the theology that is embedded in the practices of any group, what we might call operant theology, how theology is expressed in faith and real terms, real practical terms. Well, I think thinking through and just holding those four different voices of theology, keeping them in our minds, is helpful when we want to think about why bother with theology? You know, what is its role and impact? And because I think there are challenges and tensions between and among those four different voices, as well as possibilities for interpretation and insight. I mean, for example, what happens when the normative voice of theology, the authoritarian voice coming through from, say, scriptures or magisterium or from doctrine, what happens when that clashes with the practices operant in a given group? And you may be aware of the clash that is happening with a certain South London school, where the teachers in school are taking a stance according to what they see as the pastoral situation in school most suitable for their pupils, and as a result they are in direct clash and opposition with the theological position that the diocese are holding. So what happens when there's a clash between those voices? What about the movement or the connection or the flow or the lack of it between those voices? I mean, should one of those voices of theology dominate? Should they be integrated, or are they contradictory? Where should we start when we're working with people who are not formal theologians, but meet theology in their schools or their parishes, their homes and their workplaces? Australian Catholic educators Tim and Therese Dawser, I've got a pile of their books sitting on my desk. I've just picked the top one just so anybody not familiar with the name. They've got some interesting things to say about this. Like many others, they recognise that the broad and sweeping changes in society and culture. And they also make it very clear that Catholic culture itself has changed. It's not just that out there, wider society and culture, things are different. Within our Catholic circles and cultures, tremendous changes have taken place. They see that this is a discontinuity where things once taken as given can no longer be assumed. And for this, they use the image of the frontier as the unmarked or the unknown territory, saying this is the very realm where many Catholic institutions, whether they're parishes or schools or universities or leaders or teachers, the frontier is where they have to operate today. But, they say, to be equipped to live and to operate at the frontier, some engagement with theology is needed. Recognising the very rich contribution of formal doctrinal theologians, nevertheless, they say that theology must happen at grassroots level, in schools and parishes, because, and I quote, from one of their books, Mission Theology for Catholic Educators, theology is the ongoing endeavour of people within a faith community to make sense of their experience, both individual and collective, from the perspective of faith. Now, seeing that this sort of grassroots theology might be messy, less systematic and more circumstantial, they say, to the extent that we reflect on our experience in the light of faith, we are all called to be grassroots theologians. And the Belgian, I think he's Belgian, Bert Robens, educator, he says something about this too. And I'm just quoting here from one of his books. He says, theology is not a privilege solely for academics and church leaders. Even in everyday life, whether at the kitchen table or in the classroom, people can raise articulate and deep questions and develop their own theology. It's interesting that in the book on Newman that I was going through with my third year students, a book by somebody called Rod Garner, a portrait of John Henry Newman, he entitled his chapter 5 on the people of God and gave it Newman's title, All Can Be Theologians. Well, and you'll be relieved to hear that I'm moving towards the final part of what I want to say. I've been recently exploring this idea, all can be theologians, with a very small group of primary teachers from a group of schools across a local multi-academy trust. And this has formed part of a series of career professional development that I was asked to set up with them. It is not, I'm not reporting any formalised research or anything like that. The teachers are employed in the church school sector, so they fulfil their professional role in light of this. But as individual adults, of course, they carry a diversity of beliefs and past experiences as to how they interpret the human situation and their own faith position, or lack of it, with regards to God and church. They are not professionals in theology, and they themselves say they often struggle to negotiate or make sense of theological language and concepts, much of which is new to them, even though they're leading their schools, teaching the RE curriculum, doing collective worship with their pupils, and according to the diocesan inspection report, doing it very well indeed. So when I broach the idea that they are grassroots theologians, well, it met initially with doubt, denial, bemusement, and I have to say a certain level of amusement as well. And this then translated into self-doubt from the young teachers and much questioning. However, despite their initial doubts over the role and relevance of theology for them as primary teachers, they very quickly brought to the table the challenges, hopes, angst, energy, questions of their lived experience from their school setting and their own personal lives. So what happened was our best theological conversations began not with the normative or the formal voices of theology, but with the concrete issues they encountered at home or in school or classroom. And the sort of things ranged from worries about teaching a particular passage of scripture that they couldn't make head or tail of, or fears about facing pupil questions from year 5 or year 6 on a particular topic, or their own challenges when they came out as strongly disagreeing with the local bishop's pastoral letter outlining his particular doctrinal position on a certain topic, right through to some deep existential questions that they had. And what we were able to do together was to just find and create a little bit of space for freedom and the opportunity to sort of identify and explain not just our beliefs, but our incoherencies as well, and to listen and to receive from one another, to question and to critique Christian thinking, and to try and make sense and to integrate how this might apply to our professional work and our life situations. And I have to say that over the weeks, this little group of teachers has started to see that they're doing theology. It's a very different understanding than when we started out. And I think this way of working has offered them ways of thinking about Catholic faith and doctrine in relation to their own role and professional practice, and to themselves as human beings living in this particular time and place. And it certainly has brought home to me that instead of just relying on academic or official church theology, perhaps we need to learn better how to theologize with people. In fact, these young teachers have illustrated for me something that Ros wrote, way back in 1983 in one of his books called The Peaceable Kingdom. We know who we are only when we can place ourselves, locate ourselves, our story within God's story. And for sure, there are barriers to overcome, thresholds, disorientation, new thinking, previous assumptions, problems, other possibilities, etc., etc. But theology does start to make sense when we're able to reflect or act from a new perspective or frame of reference that allows us some thinking about God in light of the resources of the Christian tradition, but in a way that bears relevance and offers a coherent context for human living. Now, I realise I'm advocating here a practical theology, and in doing this, there are certainly questions about how a practical theology might move into deeper conversation with fundamental or systematic theology. Set that aside for another day. But the Second Vatican Council did affirm the pastoral nature of its teaching, that the fides qua, the life of faith, should challenge and reframe the fides quae, the content of faith. After all, revelation is in the hands of human beings, open to understanding and open to misunderstanding, certainly, but above all, open to the authentic human journey, perhaps as Pope Francis is showing us. So, in conclusion, why bother with theology? Well, I've actually come to realise that perhaps I've been asking myself the wrong question. It's not why bother with theology, but I've come to realise a better question is, why should theology bother us? And of course, I believe that theology should bother us for a whole host of reasons, because it enables us to ask, who is God? And how do we live in the light of this mystery? Because it opens up seeking an understanding of how divine transcendence can give meaning and nourish human life. Because truth matters. And if God is truth, then how can we understand more about the meaning of truth and the nature of God? Because God revealed in a story communicated in Scripture, and the resources of past and present thinkers can help communicate and with us and our own life stories, and help us make sense of the frontiers we all find ourselves in. Because we live in a contemporary world with sex and poverty and inequality and violence and race and gender and war and politics and economics and etc., etc. And because we are too often trapped within the limitations imposed by our culture, our understanding of religion, the spirit of our age, theology should bother us by challenging us to engage with these worldly realities, with how people think and feel today. And of course, theology should bother us because it calls for collective and personal responsibilities, to arouse our convictions, to lead to action, to make a better world in the light of the gospel. And because it is oriented towards new horizons of hope and possibility, and dare I say it, even transformation. There is more than just this world, this existence, this status quo. Theology should bother us to give meaning and purpose and definition to our lives as individuals and social creatures who owe it to ourselves and to one another to look after each other and the planet that we inhabit. That's just what I think. What about you? Why bother with theology? But perhaps more importantly, why should theology bother us? Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Well done, Ros.